Berlin, April 22, 1945. The city lay in ruins, a skeletal shadow of its former grandeur, and yet, deep beneath its shattered streets, life, or what remained of it, clung stubbornly in the Führer bunker. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal valet, moved quietly through the labyrinthine corridors, recording in his private notes the cadence of a crumbling regime. It was here, in the dimly lit underground compound, that the final days of the Third Reich were unfolding with a mixture of chaos, despair, and meticulous order. From the outside, the sounds of artillery fire were relentless. Soviet First Belarusian Front units, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had encircled the city, bombarding key positions with heavy Katyusha rocket barrages. The Luftwaffe, once the proud air shield of Germany, was all but grounded. The few remaining planes that could fly were scattered, leaving the Reich exposed to continuous aerial reconnaissance and attack by the Allied forces. For Hoffmann, the cacophony of destruction contrasted sharply with the unnatural calm within the bunker. He noted that Hitler continued to hold brief meetings, issuing instructions that were increasingly divorced from the reality above ground. Within these subterranean halls, tension was palpable. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, moved with a restless energy, obsessed with maintaining a facade of strength for the outside world. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, oversaw communications with military units that were rapidly dissolving under the Soviet advance. Hoffmann observed the meticulous recording of orders and the distribution of what little remained in the way of supplies, maps, documents, and personal effects of Nazi leaders. Each note he scribbled captured a level of intimacy rarely recorded: the slight tremor in Goebbels' voice as he discussed evacuation, the cold determination in Bormann's eyes, and Hitler's increasingly erratic instructions, alternating between fury and despair. Despite the bunker's apparent order, the human struggle beneath the surface was striking. Soldiers, aides, and secretaries moved with a tense efficiency, aware that death could be anywhere above or below. Hoffmann's notes detailed small but telling signs: the manner in which couriers avoided windows, the silent exchange of messages in near darkness, and the nervous glances toward ventilation shafts that had become lifelines to the world above. Outside, Soviet troops advanced on the Tiergarten and the central train stations, cutting off key escape routes and reducing the city to isolated pockets of resistance. The contrast between the calculated calm in the bunker and the chaos above formed the foundation for Hoffmann's unique perspective. Historical context gives these observations a haunting resonance. By late April, Berlin had become a fortress city under siege, with the Volkssturm, composed largely of elderly men and teenage boys, scrambling to defend sectors long abandoned by seasoned Wehrmacht units. Tank traps and barricades littered the streets, and Soviet reconnaissance scouts often encountered sporadic, desperate resistance from these improvised formations. Hoffmann, in his notes, recognized the absurdity of it all. The Führer still believes Berlin can hold. Outside, the city burns. Inside, we scribble lists of what must be done. Yet there were moments of clarity amidst the tension. Hoffmann recorded the small gestures that revealed the human side of history's most infamous figures. Goebbels' insistence on attending to the children in the bunker, Bormann's obsessive attention to documentation, and Hitler's unyielding demand for loyalty, even as the city crumbled, all painted a picture of men trapped not only by circumstance but by their own ideology. Hoffmann's hand shook as he wrote, "We are not just witnesses. We are captives of a vanishing empire." The reveal came in subtle notes that hinted at the impending finality. There were discussions of escape plans, the movement of personal treasures, and coded communications sent to scattered army units outside the city. Hoffmann sensed that some orders would never reach their destination, and that the record he maintained might be the only testament to the choices made in those last hours. Soviet patrols had reached the Spree River, and reports of brutal urban combat filtered into the bunker, confirming the inevitable collapse of Berlin's defenses. Closing this first chapter, Hoffmann's observations left an indelible tension. The Führer bunker, isolated beneath layers of concrete and steel, became a world apart from the destruction above. Within its walls, a final drama was unfolding: decisions, whispers, and preparations that would soon vanish into the chaos of history. The reader or viewer is left on the edge. What will happen in the next hours? and which of Hoffmann's meticulous records will survive the approaching storm. In this tension, the story of the last days of the Third Reich begins, framed by a single extraordinary observer who saw everything from the shadows. April 25, 1945. Berlin was a city in flames. The streets above the Reich Chancellery were unrecognizable, reduced to rubble by relentless Soviet artillery. The First Belarusian Front, spearheaded by Zhukov's mechanized units, had reached the banks of the Spree, cutting off vital supply lines and encircling pockets of desperate German defenders. Amidst this chaos, the Führerbunker remained an island of grim routine, where Heinrich Hoffmann observed and recorded the behavior of Hitler's closest aides with an almost obsessive precision. Inside the bunker, Joseph Goebbels' presence was magnetic and unnerving. As Reich Minister of Propaganda, he oscillated between fury and carefully constructed calm, attempting to maintain morale among the remaining staff. Goebbels had assumed a quasi-military authority over the bunker's personnel, issuing instructions to prepare for an urban guerrilla defense should Hitler order an evacuation. Meanwhile, Martin Bormann, ever the bureaucrat, coordinated what remained of communications to fragmented Wehrmacht units still holding the city's outskirts. Hoffmann's notes reflect a surreal reality. Secret meetings held in near darkness, orders whispered to couriers, and a constant tension between life and annihilation. The struggle for survival was not confined to the front lines. Within the bunker, Hoffmann noted the emotional strain of individuals who were suddenly tasked with impossible responsibilities. The secretary Traudl Junge, tasked with transcribing Hitler's dictations, whispered about the nervous energy that had replaced normal office discipline. Hoffmann himself moved quietly, recording snippets of conversations. The Führer's mood is volatile. Every word must be noted, every glance analyzed. Even simple actions, a hand trembling as it poured tea, the tightening of a belt in preparation for an escape route, became part of the unfolding narrative of collapse. Outside, the military reality was grim. German units, including remnants of the 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions, were scattered across the city, attempting to form ad hoc defensive positions. Soviet artillery and tank units systematically reduced German strongpoints, while reconnaissance squads mapped every street, every barricade. Hoffmann's notes reveal a detailed awareness of the situation above ground, reports of Soviet machine gun nests, snipers hiding among ruins, and civilians trapped between crossfires. He observed that the city itself was both a battlefield and a prison for those below, the walls of the bunker isolating its occupants from the true scale of destruction just meters above their heads. Historical insight deepens the tension. By late April, the Allies' understanding of Hitler's location had grown through intercepted communications, yet a precise timeline of his orders remained elusive. Hoffmann's observations provide a unique counterpoint, the human element of history that intelligence could never fully capture. He documented subtle patterns, noting, for example, that Hitler would receive reports in the morning and immediately request confirmation from multiple aides, a practice that reflected both paranoia and meticulous control. This methodical approach underscored the contradiction of leadership in collapse. Total authority exercised in an environment of total chaos. The reveal in this stage of the story centers on the coded instructions and secret messages circulating among the bunker's staff. Hoffmann's notes hint at communications with surviving army units attempting to hold the city. Some messages instructed units to stand firm at all costs, while others suggested possible escape routes through less contested northern sectors. The fate of these instructions, however, remained uncertain. Allied and Soviet intelligence would later uncover fragments of some messages, but many were never recovered, swallowed by the rubble or lost in the flight of those who survived. Hoffmann's observations also capture the psychological warfare within the bunker. Each member of the inner circle navigated fear differently. Goebbels clung to propaganda fantasies of continued resistance, Bormann sought to impose order through meticulous documentation, and Hitler himself vacillated between denial and rage. Hoffmann's hand shook as he recorded these behaviors, noting small but telling details. The angle of Hitler's gaze when reviewing maps, the hurried erasures of typed orders, and the whispered conversations in corners that hinted at contingency plans that may never have been enacted. As Part 2 closes, the viewer is left with a sense of mounting pressure. The city outside is a crucible of fire, and within the bunker, the final stages of a collapsing regime are played out with obsessive precision. Hoffmann's record, both personal and historical, begins to take shape as a key source for understanding the final hours of Nazi leadership. Yet the mystery remains. Which messages will survive, which orders will be carried out, and which secrets of the bunker will vanish into history as the Soviet assault tightens its grip on Berlin? The tension is palpable, and the next hours promise to reveal decisions that will seal the fate of a regime on the brink of annihilation. April 28, 1945. The air in Berlin was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of blood. Outside the reinforced walls of the Reich Chancellery, the First Belarusian Front had intensified its bombardment, reducing whole neighborhoods to ash. Soviet artillery fire rained down relentlessly on Tiergarten and the surrounding government district, while mechanized units advanced through shattered streets, systematically dismantling the city's defenses. Inside the Führer bunker, Heinrich Hoffmann's meticulous records captured a world in suspended panic, a shadowed microcosm of humanity at the edge of extinction. By this point, the bunker's occupants were acutely aware that time was no longer on their side. Hitler's health and temperament were deteriorating, and his inner circle was visibly strained under the weight of imminent defeat. Joseph Goebbels, always theatrical, had taken to pacing corridors in fits of fury, dictating last-minute propaganda directives to maintain the illusion of resistance. Martin Bormann, meanwhile, coordinated communication attempts with the remaining Wehrmacht units, often receiving partial or corrupted messages, leaving him increasingly anxious and frustrated. Hoffmann's notes reveal the tension in detail: the abruptness of meetings, the hush in hallways, and the nervous whispers about escape and contingency plans. The human struggle within the bunker had become a delicate balance between survival and duty. Hoffmann observed aides like Traudl Junge working tirelessly to record Hitler's orders, while others, like Hitler's personal adjutants, handled confidential documents that might hold the key to the Reich's final directives. Hoffmann's diary entries hint at the surreal atmosphere. The Führer appears detached from reality, yet every command is precise. We move through shadows, carrying the remnants of a collapsing world. The juxtaposition of calm procedural order against the backdrop of a city under siege added an unnerving tension to his observations. Historical context underscores the desperation. The German defenders outside, including remnants of the 9th Army and assorted Volkssturm battalions, were fragmented, often retreating under overwhelming Soviet pressure. Urban warfare intensified as Soviet infantry and armored columns cleared sectors street by street, house by house. Intelligence reports intercepted by Allied units highlighted confusion and disorganization among German command structures. Yet inside the bunker, leadership seemed trapped in a loop of ritual and paranoia, sending out orders that were increasingly disconnected from operational reality. The reveal on April 28 centered on the unusual behavior of Hitler and his inner staff. Hoffmann recorded that Hitler issued contradictory instructions to his generals and aides, suggesting both final defense and potential evacuation. The notes detailed secret movements of personal effects, hidden valuables, and even small arms caches, hinting at plans that may never have been executed. The fate of these orders remained uncertain. Would they be delivered, ignored, or lost entirely in the chaos enveloping the city? Hoffmann's writings, almost obsessive in their detail, preserved these last-minute traces of the Führer's final decisions. As the day progressed, Soviet artillery neared the Reich Chancellery itself. Tracer rounds lit the sky above the bunker, and distant explosions shook the reinforced ceilings. Inside, the staff took measures to preserve their lives and documents. Hoffmann noted coded messages being sent through couriers and small tunnels, though he questioned whether any would reach their intended recipients. The psychological tension was heightened by the realization that the world above ground was disintegrating at an unstoppable pace, and every moment spent in the bunker brought them closer to the city's total fall. Hoffmann also documented the subtle personal dynamics: whispered arguments over loyalty, silent judgments about who might survive, and small acts of human connection. Hand squeezes, hurried reassurances, and furtive glances that betrayed fear. These micro-moments contrasted sharply with the larger strategic collapse and added a haunting layer to the narrative. The reader is reminded that history is made not only by grand decisions but by the smallest, human acts observed in the shadow of catastrophe. As Part 3 concludes, the sense of impending doom is undeniable. Berlin teeters on the brink, and the bunker's inhabitants face decisions that could determine life or death. Hoffman's records hint at the chaos and indecision that define the final hours, capturing the precise moment when control is slipping from hands desperate to maintain it. The tension lingers. Which instructions will survive, which individuals will vanish, and how will these last documented observations illuminate the reality of Hitler's final hours? The story stands at the edge of revelation, ready to descend into the ultimate night of the Third Reich. April 29, 1945. The Reich Chancellery bunker, once a symbol of unshakable power, now felt like a tomb. Above, Berlin was a fractured wasteland, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, fires consuming what remained of civilian neighborhoods, and the constant rumble of Soviet artillery echoing like a grim drumbeat. Inside, Heinrich Hoffmann continued his painstaking observations, recording the final moments of Nazi leadership with a clarity born of necessity and perhaps fear. Each note he wrote captured the precarious balance between order and chaos, between obedience and the instinct to survive. By this day, Hitler's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Hoffmann documented how the Führer dictated final messages, reviewed maps with trembling hands, and gave instructions to aides and staff in a voice alternating between fevered urgency and detached monotony. Joseph Goebbels, ever the orchestrator of narrative, focused on the distribution of propaganda, but even he could not mask the desperation in the room. Martin Bormann monitored communications with the remaining German units, but messages from the front lines were sparse and often incomplete, leaving him to wonder which orders could realistically be executed. The struggle was both tactical and profoundly human. Staff members, including Traudl Junge and other secretaries, meticulously transcribed and archived Hitler's last directives, knowing full well that these records could vanish within hours. Couriers moved cautiously through the bunker's tunnels, carrying messages that might never reach their destination. Outside, the First Belarusian front pressed closer, with Soviet scouts reaching as near as the Tiergarten, exchanging fire with desperate German remnants. Hoffmann noted that even the smallest details, the tightening of a belt, a hurried glance toward the stairwell, a hastily hidden document, spoke volumes about the tension in the bunker. Historical context reinforces the precariousness of the moment. Soviet forces had now taken control of large sections of central Berlin, including the Reichstag and key railway junctions. German defenses were fractured and sporadic, with remnants of the 11th Panzer Division and the Volkssturm attempting to hold narrow corridors between barricades. Intelligence reports from British and American units indicated that Hitler's bunker had become an isolated fortress, effectively cut off from the remainder of the Reich. In these conditions, every decision made within those subterranean walls carried extraordinary weight, and Hoffmann's meticulous notes preserved these fleeting historical truths. The reveal on April 29 was particularly striking. Hoffmann recorded the creation of secret instructions and personal notes, including directives concerning evacuation routes, the transfer of valuables, and the fate of key personnel. Some documents were to be hidden, some sent through couriers, and others stored in seemingly innocuous locations. As the day wore on, the likelihood that all of these instructions would survive the Soviet advance diminished rapidly. Hoffmann's writings reflect both the urgency and uncertainty. Everything is in motion, yet we do not know which movements will endure. Above ground, Soviet forces began systematically combing through the ruins. Explosions occasionally shook the bunker, and the distant cries of battle reminded those inside that the city was no longer a place of order but a theater of total collapse. Hoffmann's observations captured both fear and quiet heroism, acts of courage, quick thinking, and human resilience in the midst of almost certain annihilation. He noted how aides and soldiers attempted to safeguard the remaining documents, even as chaos threatened to engulf everything. By the evening, the bunker had entered its most critical phase. Hitler's final notes and secret instructions were written, hidden, or dispatched, but the survival of these documents was already in question. Couriers left with uncertain fates, and fragments of these instructions would later resurface in intelligence archives, while others disappeared completely. Hoffmann's meticulous record-keeping became the only continuous thread in a story about to be fractured by history itself. As Part 4 closes, the tension remains palpable. The city above is nearly lost, and the bunker below holds its last traces of order, fear, and secrecy. Hoffman's notes provide a tantalizing glimpse into decisions that may never have reached fruition. The audience is left with a sense of anticipation and mystery. Which of these final messages will survive? Which orders will influence events outside the bunker? And how will history ultimately interpret the documents that have disappeared into the chaos of Berlin's fall? The stage is set for the end, the moment when the Third Reich collapses and Hoffman's observations become fragments of an enduring historical enigma. April 30th, 1945. Berlin was a city suffocating under the weight of its own destruction. The streets, once teeming with life, were now a twisted labyrinth of rubble, ash, and smoke. Soviet artillery shells exploded with relentless precision, and street-to-street combat had reduced the city to isolated pockets of resistance. Inside the Führer bunker, Heinrich Hoffmann meticulously recorded the final hours, capturing moments that would become some of the most scrutinized and debated fragments of World War II history. Hitler's health and mood had deteriorated further, and his commands became increasingly contradictory and urgent. Hoffmann observed the Führer dictating his last personal messages, signing documents that would determine the fate of the remaining inner circle, and instructing aides in matters that often seemed detached from reality. Joseph Goebbels, ever the loyalist, prepared for the symbolic continuation of Nazi ideology, while simultaneously grappling with the imminent collapse of their power. Martin Bormann coordinated the transfer of documents and valuables, his attention to detail unwavering even as the world outside fell apart. The human struggle within the bunker reached its zenith. Staff members, including Traudl Junge, moved with extraordinary focus under unimaginable stress, documenting every word, gesture, and whispered conversation. Couriers navigated narrow passages, carrying secret orders into the chaotic city above, uncertain if they would survive to deliver their messages. Hoffmann's notes capture the tension of these moments, highlighting the fragility of both life and historical evidence. We are surrounded, yet work as though the world will last forever. Every note may be our last witness. Outside the bunker, Soviet troops were closing in on key targets. Units of the 150th Rifle Division and elements of the 3rd Shock Army engaged in brutal urban combat, reducing strongpoints and clearing streets inch by inch. German defenders, including remnants of the 9th and 11th Armies, resisted sporadically but were overwhelmingly outmatched. Hoffmann's observations reveal the contrast. While the world above fought for survival, the bunker below existed in a suspended reality, where strategy, paranoia, and loyalty intertwined with desperation. Historical insight provides crucial context. Hitler's final actions, including the signing of last wills and political testament, reflected both the ideological rigidity and the fatal detachment from military reality that had characterized his leadership. Hoffmann's notes include descriptions of secret orders for evacuation, document preservation, and even instructions for those tasked with destroying evidence if capture was imminent. Some orders were carried out, others vanished with the fall of the city. The fate of these notes became one of the enduring mysteries of the final days of the Third Reich. The reveal on April 30th centers on the confirmation of Hitler's death. Hoffmann documented the immediate reactions of those around him. Shock, silence, and a tense deliberation over the next steps. The surviving staff faced critical decisions, whether to surrender, attempt escape, or follow secret contingency plans outlined in Hitler's notes. Goebbels' subsequent actions, including the tragic decision concerning his family, further underscore the moral and psychological collapse within the bunker. Hoffmann's detailed observations would later serve as an essential record, providing historians with insight into both individual choices and broader systemic failure. As the day drew to a close, the bunker's remaining occupants, including Hoffmann, disappeared into the ruins of Berlin. Some blended into civilian crowds. Others were captured by advancing Soviet forces. Hoffmann's final notes, however, survived as fragments, a patchwork of personal diary, witness account, and historical record. They captured the essence of human behavior under extreme duress, the strategies and failures of a collapsing regime, and the mysterious movements of documents and messages that would intrigue intelligence agencies for years to come. The tension at the end of Part 5 is almost unbearable. The city above lies in ruin, the regime is extinct, and yet questions linger. Which messages were successfully delivered, which secrets were lost forever, and how much of what Hoffmann recorded would survive the onslaught of history? As the Führer bunker empties and the Third Reich vanishes, the audience is left on the edge of revelation, with the final chapter promising both resolution and lingering mystery. The ultimate reckoning with the shadows of war. May 1st, 1945. The ruins of Berlin were quiet in comparison to the previous days, but the silence carried the weight of total devastation. Fires still smoldered across the cityscape, and the scent of gunpowder and smoke lingered in every street. Soviet troops patrolled methodically, documenting survivors, detaining remaining German personnel, and searching for remnants of Nazi leadership. Beneath the rubble, the Führer bunker, once the nerve center of the Third Reich, stood empty, save for the scattered papers and notes left behind. Heinrich Hoffmann's meticulous records had survived the initial chaos, though many of the documents he had observed vanish into uncertainty, their fate entwined with the crumbling city above. The immediate struggle now shifted from survival to revelation. Hoffmann's notes, diaries, and observations offered a unique and intimate window into Hitler's final hours, but questions lingered. What had truly happened within those subterranean walls? Which orders had been followed, which lost, and which remained secret for decades? Couriers who had survived reported fragments of messages to Allied intelligence, while Soviet forces recovered documents that only partially corroborated Hoffmann's account. The incompleteness of the record created an enduring tension. The full story of the bunker's last days could never be known with absolute certainty. Hoffmann's observations provided insight into the psychology of men confronting the end. He had recorded subtle cues, the careful preservation of Hitler's personal items, whispered conversations about loyalty and survival, and the quiet resolve of those who remained in the bunker until the very end. Each note hinted at decisions made under extreme duress, choices that were strategic, ethical, and profoundly human. His writings reveal not only the factual progression of events, but also the emotional weight borne by the bunker's occupants as they confronted the collapse of their world. Historical context deepens the resonance of these final moments. By May 1st, the Soviet Third Shock Army and elements of the First Belarusian Front had secured key government buildings, including the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. Surviving German units had largely surrendered or dissolved into the civilian population. International intelligence agencies, including the British MI6 and the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, sought to recover remaining documents and testimonies from the bunker, recognizing their unparalleled historical value. Yet even the most diligent searches could not account for every note, directive, or observation Hoffmann had recorded, leaving gaps that fueled decades of speculation and scholarly debate. The reveal in this final chapter emphasizes the partial survival of Hoffmann's records. Some notes, detailing Hitler's last conversations, secret instructions, and observations of his aides, were archived in intelligence files and later used by historians to reconstruct the final days of the Third Reich. Other notes, possibly the most sensitive, disappeared entirely, lost to fire, theft, or the chaos of the city's fall. These missing fragments continue to tantalize historians, representing shadows of truth that may never be fully recovered. Application of these observations extends beyond mere historical curiosity. Hoffmann's records illustrate the fragility of human systems under extreme stress, the tension between obedience and personal survival, and the way small acts, scribbled notes, whispered orders, or preserved documents, can alter the understanding of history itself. Modern military historians and intelligence analysts study these final hours to understand decision-making in conditions of collapse, the vulnerabilities of command structures, and the human factors that influence historical events. As Part 6 closes, the story of the Führer bunker ends not with certainty, but with a lingering sense of mystery. Hoffmann's notes survive as a partial testament, offering unparalleled insight into Hitler's last hours, the psychology of his inner circle, and the human dimension of a regime in collapse. Yet the vanished messages, the destroyed documents, and the decisions lost to history leave unanswered questions. What else did Hoffmann witness that was never recorded? What instructions never reached their destination? And how many secrets remain buried beneath Berlin's ruins? The final notes, like shadows in the rubble, remain both a record and a mystery. inviting continued investigation, reflection, and awe at the fragility of power and the persistence of memory in the face of annihilation.